oh, these teachers are trying to indoctrinate students. It's not really that at all. I actually use critical race theory. It's a framework, a theoretical framework, in order to understand how society works and in order to understand or how it works in terms of distributing resources and are based on race. So it's certain principles, perhaps we could say, about how to go ahead and how to analyze what happens in society. So it's more like an academic framework for us academics to use in order to understand what we're observing. It's not really something that is taught in high school.
Welcome to Latinx in Power, a podcast hosted by Thaisa Fernandes.
Welcome to Latinx in Power. Today we are talking with Laura Chávez-Moreno. Laura is an award-winning researcher at UCLA, specializing in Latinx education, with a deep commitment to understanding and addressing systemic racism in educational settings. She studies the impact of bilingual education programs on Latinx students. Very excited with this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm also very excited.
Amazing. In this episode, Laura discusses her journey into the field of Latinx education and the systemic barriers that hinder effective bilingual education. She will share insights for educators, parents, and policymakers aimed to ensuring equitable educational outcomes for all Latinx students. And this is one of my favorite questions, the question that I usually start the podcast. What does it mean to be a Latina for you?
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. So I think that for me, it reminds me of how race and racial constructs, racial ideas are very context-based. So depending on the context, I'm seen by others as Latina, Latinx, or for example, when I go back to Mexico, where I'm from, I'm seen as Mexican. And in terms of race, I'm seen as different based on where I am in Mexico and then also where I am in the US. But it reminds me that the term Latinx is really a racialized category in the US, since it's not really something that's understood in Latin America.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I discovered that I'm a Latina only 10 years ago when I moved to the United States. And I can see a lot of other folks that I interview for the podcast sharing the same thing. And I think the experience of folks who are in Europe a little bit different than the ones who migrated, who are in the United States.
Yes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. I'd love to hear more, your thoughts about it.
About the experience, or
yeah, like the depending on where you are in United States or in Europe or your main country, you might experience your Latin experience differently.
interesting to think about race as a way that people see you, but it's also interesting it's important to remember that the different contexts and how different people assume what is race is also different. So even though in the US, for example, we talk about race as if it's something that we can see, that's actually something that society teaches us to be able to see. So it's not just a normal way to evaluate people. It is something that we learn in society. And because societies are different in terms of what is it that they teach in terms of that society, it is different in terms of how people are seen in terms of their race. Something else that I'd like to mention is that the racial categories are different based on the context. So for example, in Guatemala, there's a racial category that's called Ladino. So it's different from Latino. And Ladino, it has a D, that's a racial category that, for example, if someone in the US said like, oh, I identify as Ladino, no one would understand that. That's illegible here in the US. So the same thing happens, for example, if I were to go to another country in Latin America and I say, oh, I'm Latina, it's not understood in the same way as it is here in the US. And here in the US, it's important to note that the term Latinx comes from the term Hispanic, which comes from the term Spanish speaking. And it is a way to just lump people based on what is imagined in terms of what their experiences are, what their languages are, etc. So it's really this process of lumping people together, whether they would want to be in this group or not. You mentioned, for example, you didn't know you were a Latina until you came here to the US. This is exactly what happens in terms of this lumping of people into this category. And what race does is it does this in service of or in order to oppress certain groups. So it's not just something in terms of lumping people together in order to classify them, and then that's it. Everyone is, oh, we have differences. It's nice to have differences. Racialization is actually about the process of doing that in order to dehumanize certain people.
Incredible. I really like this conversation. I'm enjoying this so much. I think it's so important to talk more about that. And can you share more the pivotal moment or experience that inspired you to focus on Latinx education and what led you to research this topic?
Thank you. So it's interesting because I wouldn't say that there's just one pivotal moment, but if I had to think about like what were some of the instances in my life that have really contributed to the questions that I'm interested in, it has to start with my education as an immigrant student here in the US and noticing why it was that, for example, in Mexico, I was seen as a student who was smart, who was able, who had good parents, who cared about me. And then just crossing a borderline, just 10 minutes from one place to the other, all of a sudden I was seen as this English language learner, as someone who was struggling in schools, who maybe their parents didn't even care about them. There's all these different ideas that people had about me that were different. And I noticed this as a child in the sense of I'm the same person, but here in the US, I was seen by teachers as not as smart or not as capable as I was, for example, in Mexico. So it started really early for me. And when I was progressing through school here in the US, I noticed that a lot of students who looked like me in classrooms were receiving an education that assumed that they were also deficient. So it wasn't just me as an individual, it was as a group. We suffered through an education that really looked down upon us and provided less services to us than other students in my school who were racialized as white.
Yeah. And how was this process for you? It was something that you noticed right away? It was something that you needed some time to realize what was happening? Because I feel like sometimes, especially when it comes to microaggressions, at least with me, there's some certain things that happen with me that are like, oh, I know what it was that I felt weird, but I didn't know, I didn't have a language for that. And now I understand, oh, that was bad. That was right. But at the time, I didn't even notice. Did it happen to you? How was for you this process?
Well, it's hard to say. I know that it was throughout my life, and it was not something that happened immediately. It was something that I would notice and then I would reflect upon. And when I was studying education for example, as an undergrad or as a graduate student, that's when also ideas that stuck with me in terms of my experiences in childhood, that's when I started understanding certain ideas or certain experiences in a way that was racial or racialized. So it did take learning from me in the sense of I did the racial imagination and the racial landscape and the way racialization works, for example, where I'm from in Mexico, was different than in the US. So as an immigrant, I had to learn what those differences were. And it wasn't immediate. I had to learn through, for example, in school and through my experiences. So it was a whole process throughout my life. And I'm still learning about it now.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing all this knowledge with us. I love doing this podcast because of that. I feel like selfishly I learned a lot, but also hopefully we are also helping other people. And talking about helping, how can communities and families become more involved in advocating for equitable education practices and ensuring that Latinx voices are heard in decision making?
Sure. I think one of the things that's a big lesson in the book is for communities and for schools to recognize that we live in a racialized society. And because we live in a racialized society, our institutions, for example, our schools, which are a very important institution in our society, contribute to what our ideas about what race are, which is actually why what I mean by when I say schools make race, which is part of the title of my book. So schools make race because they are an important institution in our society, and they teach us in indirect ways and in direct ways what is race and what is racialized groups. So for me, one of the things that I'm hoping the book speaks to and families and communities can take from this is that we have to recognize that this is already happening in our schools. And because it's already happening, we have to be intentional in making sure that the lessons that students are learning are progressing their racial ideas into critical racial consciousness.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and how parents can be part of this process. And I think it also comes to you as an individual, because I feel when you are an immigrant, there's this new language, this new culture, this new world that is almost like you have a new personality, maybe a different personality from your main language. And this entire process is already very, very challenging. I think I'm like funnier in Portuguese, and I still didn't figure out fully my English language and how I can be the way I am in Portuguese, and maybe I will never be. I think this is one thing that I was thinking as you were talking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting what our language also allows us to express about ourselves, and how our language sometimes inhibits us in certain ways or shows different sides of us. Perhaps we could think about it that way also. So yeah, I've also experienced the same thing, and I have many family members who also have experienced the same thing.
And what advice would you give for someone who is listening to us and maybe they just moved, or they are considering moving to another country, this new language and culture, and I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I guess because I'm a researcher that's focused on race, I would be interested, I would say perhaps think about how that society constructs its different social groups. So what are the different social groups in that society? And in the US, for example, if we think about what are the social groups in our society, there's lots of different ways that society groups people. But one of the ways that the US has been doing historically and is still doing right now is it constructs racialized groups based on how it distributes resources. So how does a country, for example, the US, distribute resources to these certain groups in order to form these different groups and maintain inequalities and oppress certain groups? So that's something that I'm always interested when I travel, for example, to different countries. I try to learn about how that country or how that region creates these different social groups through the ways that it distributes resources inequitably.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that, the research angle of it. And in what ways can educators advocate for anti-racist teaching practices within the classrooms, particularly in the bilingual setting?
Sure. So I think one of the ways that they could advocate for this is through recognizing, first off, that's always point one, recognizing that schools are part of our society that contributes to ideas about race, and then be very explicit and intentional and systematic about how we're teaching about these ideas, so that we're teaching towards practices that are teaching, excuse me, so that we're working towards teaching practices that will help students engage in anti-racist activities. So I think that's one of the important ways. I think it's also important for educators to connect with communities, and communities also recognize that teachers are professionals and that teachers need support in order to engage in this work. Because in the US, it's very difficult right now because there's this national debate that is about banning teaching about race and banning critical race theory. And I use critical race theory as what they describe, but it's really not critical race theory. But I mention that because that's really the wrong debate for us to be having. What we should be talking about is how to improve instruction that teaches critically about race. So that's one of the things that I think we really need to advocate for, and to make sure to have a progression of ideas so that students are taught about our racialized society in ways that is appropriate for them. And the reason I say that is because in my research in the book, I found that sometimes students were very bored with their lessons about race and about like social justice. And then when I asked them why, and when also what I observed, what happened was that they were learning the same lessons over and over again since they were like in kindergarten or elementary school. But once they were in high school, they were really ready for other more advanced ideas.
That's so interesting. And how would you define critical race theory? Can you share with us?
Sure. So it's definitely not the way that most people have probably heard about it in the media in terms of this very scary thing that, oh, these teachers are trying to indoctrinate students. It's not really that at all. I actually use critical race theory. It's a framework, a theoretical framework, in order to understand how society works and in order to understand how it works in terms of this racial, or how it works in terms of distributing resources based on race. So it's certain principles, perhaps we could say, about how to go ahead and how to analyze what happens in society. So it's more like an academic framework for us academics to use in order to understand what we're observing. It's not really something that is taught in high schools. I mean, there may be one or two high schools that teach about it, for example, in an ethnic studies program, but it's not really a widespread thing that schools are teaching. And I'm not saying that it actually shouldn't be. Maybe we should have that as part of lessons that high school students learn. But what is going on though right now in the US is this attack about critical race theory, and I'm saying that in quotes, in order to just do away with anything that the extreme right objects to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of started answering my next question about it, which was like, why do you think they are attacking what do you think they're attacking this, since it's not even taught in school, but you think it should have, they're like distorting the whole idea? Like, what are your thoughts about it?
Oh, I think it's really an attack on public schools and on teachers, because teachers are professionals. Good teachers follow the questions of their students and change their teaching based on what students' questions are. So in my classroom, when I was a classroom teacher, and in the classrooms that I visit, students have a lot of questions about race. So a good teacher follows the student questions and try and has them explore, gives them resources, etc. So what happens is this movement to ban critical race theory is also attached to other movements that are anti-public education and defunding our public schools. It's not alone in the sense of like they're focusing on race just because. It's really a concerted effort in order for the public to lose faith in our public institutions and to lose faith in public schools and defund them.
Interesting. I was thinking that this moment not empowering people, but it's more than that, right? That's really sad.
Yes, and we have to be very, very careful and very vigilant. And that's why I emphasize for communities to also support teachers who are engaged in this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what do you see as the primary systemic barrier that prevent bilingual education programs from effectively serving Latinx students?
So I think first of all, I want to mention that I'm a big proponent of bilingual education. Bilingual education is something that is needed in the US because historically the US has just focused on immigrants or other racialized students just learning English and not caring about whether they maintain their home languages, which is not a good way for education to function. So bilingual education is an important corrective to that. But just because it's an important corrective doesn't mean that it doesn't have flaws, right? Bilingual education is in a context that is very um, it wants to maintain the status quo. It wants to not discuss race. It wants to maintain inequities. So bilingual education is constantly having to fight against this. And one of the things that I think that we really should focus on bilingual education and improving it in terms of it effectively serving Latinx students is for bilingual education educators to recognize that bilingual education is part of our racialized society. So there's no way of escaping teaching about race. And because there's no way of escaping this, we should do it intentionally and in critical ways that advance critical racial consciousness. One of the things that has happened in the US, though, is that bilingual education has really focused on just English learning and just advancing English and just language education. Whereas bilingual education, in my point of view, really should be drawing from ethnic studies in order to improve how it delivers an education to racialized students.
That's so interesting. I'm learning a lot, I think, for me, especially because I moved to this country as an adult. I speak Portuguese with my family, very comfortable with my language. So I didn't have this process of, although I was fluent in English when I moved, but when I moved, I was almost like I was learning the language again because I feel it's so different, like live in your second language than like as a tourist on vacation. It's just so different, right? It's just
Yes.
especially studying. I did a lot of like different courses and an extension course, and I have like this math uh, class, and I was like, I need to translate all the numbers and do the math. That's really hard because the teacher was saying like what we were supposed to do, and I was like, oh my god, this is so overwhelming because I need to translate everything, even the numbers, so I can do the calculations.
Yeah. Language learning is an intense process for sure. And then Arabic is not only language learning. It's also when we move to a different country, it's also this language learning, but also learning about the context, the history, the mannerisms. It's so many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to talk more about your book, How Schools Make Race. You discuss Latinx racialization. And can you explain more this concept and what it means and how it manifests in bilingual education programs?
Sure, thank you. So I talked a little bit about what I meant by how schools making race. What does that mean? So let me focus on what I mean by this Latinx racialization. And what I mean by that is that bilingual education programs, because they are implemented in order to fight against racism, which I discussed earlier, in order to fight against just, for example, learning English and assimilating Latinx students into the US. It is a program that is anti-racist, but in gathering students in order for them to be in these classrooms, that process of lumping them together based on what is imagined is their Spanish language, we lump them together, and then that reinforces the idea that there is this Latinx group in our society. And then along with that, what the program teaches in terms of the Latinx culture, and I use that like in quotes because it is really undefined. When I asked teachers, what is Latinx culture or Latino culture? They really gave me very vague ideas that could be for any group. And then when they were very specific in terms of like, oh, well, this celebration or this, they talked about it, but in terms of what were some of the subgroups. So for example, Mexican Americans do this and Dominican Americans do that. So it wasn't really something specific to Latinx that was a shared cultural practice. It was more examples of what are other subgroups, for example. So again, in this process of lumping people together, bilingual education helps form our ideas as a society about what is Latinx as a group. And in the program, they did this explicitly and implicitly.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, and I quite often think about that and how this sense of like being a Latinx, Latin person, Latina, whatever you want to call, it's so personal at the same time, and it feels weird when we are grouped in this huge group that is not. We don't even have one language. It's not only Spanish. We have many, 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 many others and celebrations, and it's so interesting. And as you did all this research and like learn a ton with this process, what would you say to your younger self after doing all this work, perhaps when you're like in school or like,
Sure. Well, if I could talk to my younger self, I would say read more.
Uh-huh.
Because I didn't actually like reading until I was forced to read in my PhD program. So it was interesting because it wasn't something that I identified with. I didn't really see myself as a reader, let alone a writer. That came way later. So I would say to my younger self, like explore different worlds through reading in order for you to also expand your mind. So I was as a youth, I was very interested in learning, but it wasn't something, but I didn't think about reading in terms of learning. And there's different ways of learning, obviously, but it was not something that I really gravitated to.
That's a great advice. So yeah, and then you wrote a book. That's incredible. So we are going to link to the description of your episode where people can find your book. So you're going to do that. And talking about resources, I feel I love this question and I love this idea of getting tailored advice from amazing and inspiring people. And I'm with you. I think books are a game changer because it can help us so much and expedite our learning process. And I talk about this in the podcast already, but the public libraries in US are great. So I just wanted to encourage people to go to a public library. You can also access a lot of different apps, audiobooks. There's like a lot of like really, really, really good resources that people should take advantage of. Even like movies, I always check Canopy app, so I watch great movies via my library card. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I love the plug for public libraries.
Yeah, and can you share some resources that helped you in your journey? It can be anything.
Sure. Well, in terms of the journey for writing this book, one of the things that I really, really loved was reading Octavia Butler's books. So those were a good way for me to withdraw from my own thinking about my study and also to enjoy reading because for some of the academic reading that I was doing, some of them I enjoyed, but for different reasons. And then reading nonfiction was helpful for me in order to also see different writing style that I was aiming towards because I wanted the book to be accessible to educators, and I really wanted the book to have a style that was appealing and was more storytelling. So during the time that I was writing the book, I was also reading a lot of nonfiction in order for me to see different styles of writing and then to also help me find my own writing voice.
That's a great advice. And do you have any specific advice for? I always talk about like how excited I get when I see Latin people writers. So if there's someone listening to us that are thinking about writing their book or they are writing a book already, which advice would you give them besides like do it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you say besides do it, because the process of writing is really what developed the ideas of this book also. So I didn't start with the book already in my mind and I just had to type it down. It was through the process of writing and through the process of reading and thinking that I was able to then come up with this book. And one of the things that I advise friends or people who ask me about the process of writing is that if you have writer's block, there's two things that I suggest you do. One is read, because that helps stimulate ideas. Whenever I feel like I'm not really understanding something, I don't really know what else to write about it, or I'm not really sure what it is that my point is, I read something related so that it can spark my ideas about what it is that I'm arguing, for example, or that I want to convey. And then another thing is when you're writing, you just have to make sure to write, even if it's something that you think you're going to throw away, it doesn't make sense, etc. The process of writing will help you also clarify your ideas. So really, it's the process of engaging with your ideas and sitting down and really having uninterrupted time. That's so important for a writer, to be able to sit down without distractions. So when I'm writing, I turn off my cell phone alerts or any other thing. I don't check email. I put on the timer for 30 minutes and then I'm just concentrated on writing, because distractions are the worst thing for writers in terms of like how you're able to focus on what you're doing. And it really fatigues my brain, at least it fatigues me, and it really makes me like lose my train of thought when I have a lot of distractions when I'm writing.
Oh, that's a great advice. I feel some people might think, oh, I need to know what I'm writing about. And what you're saying, no, you need to write sometimes in order to know what you're going to write about, what your book is going to be about. That's a great advice. Wanted to thank you for your time. That was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation. I want to leave
Thank
the
you.
last minutes for you to share anything you want to share with us and where people can find you.
Find me. I have a website. It's just laurachavesmoreno.com, laurachavesmoreno.com. And if they'd like to sign up for my newsletter, I do post events that are coming up. I also am on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter, or X now. And if they'd like to purchase the book, it's available at Harvard Education Press, at Bookshop, at Barnes & Noble, and on Amazon. And I'd love to hear what readers think, so please post a review on it.
That's also amazing. We are going to link where people can find you and, of course, your book. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Obrigada.